Good morning to everybody. Today we're going to talk about the World War I, or poets, also called war poets. Who were the war poets? The war poets is a name, a phrase, which is given to a group of men who fought in the trenches during the First World War. These poets have many common aspects. First of all, they all took part in the war as soldiers. They all enrolled enthusiastically when War I broke out. They were all in their late 20s, so they were very young when they enrolled, when they joined the war. And finally, they wrote poems in which the war is described as a terrible experience, leading to death, suffering, and alienation. When we talk about the war poets, we mean a group made up of these names. The first one was Rupert Brooke. He is considered to be a war poet, even though he's got very different characteristics from the others, because he actually experienced only the very first part of the war experience. Therefore, he reflected in his poems a different attitude that would soon change in the following months. The other more representative poets of the group were Wilfred Owen, who is considered to be the greatest, also for his poetic achievements, Siegfried Sassoon, and Isaac Rosenberg. We are going to study only the first two, so Rupert Brooke and Wilfred Owen, and you can find information about this from page 234 to page 237 on your book. Okay, so World War I was at the heart of the cultural and poetic experience of these poets and of the people at the beginning of the 20th century. As you can see in this image, here we've got the typical picture of a Napoleonic soldier. Before the experience of World War I, these were how soldiers were dressed and how war and war experience was conceived, was considered. So the typical Napoleonic soldier was dressed in beautiful colors. He usually had a sword, maybe a horse, shining boots, and there was no idea of what was real warfare. We had a very idealized vision of the soldier who was seen as a hero and very often pictured, portrayed. There was this idea of the soldier who was always willing to sacrifice himself to a country and to his country. So there was no image of blood, violence, of wounds or amputations connected with soldiers or the pictures of the soldiers. When Britain entered World War I, they entered with the assumption that they would win and that the war would be very quick. They in fact thought that it would be over by Christmas, but actually it wasn't like that. They thought it would be very much like Napoleonic wars, but that wasn't. So they soon understood that it was not a classical war, that they had to live in the trenches, to fight and to spend long, horrible days in the trenches. So that's why we change from this shiny, heroic uniform and image of the soldier to a new image of the soldier who was wearing the so-called khaki uniform. Khaki is a name which was invented at the time to indicate this kind of brownish, greenish color, which was typical of the uniform of the soldiers, and that was very similar to the ground, to the environment, to the trenches in which they had to live and in which they have to fight. The environment itself was very different from the past experience of the war. In fact, There were very few trees in the trenches, especially in the so-called Western Front, where the greatest part of the line of the trenches was running. Very few buildings were present in that place. Most of them were destroyed. The most distinctive feature was a bare landscape full of mud, especially when it rained. And in the place of the Western Front, so in the Northern Europe, it rained really a lot and really often. So the experience was a real shock. Living, fighting, spending long hours and long days was a horrible, nightmarish days in the trenches became a horrible and nightmarish experience for these young soldiers. So as I said at the beginning, First World War was welcomed with great enthusiasm. Thousands of young men volunteered and joined the military service. They thought at the beginning that the war was an occasion to bring about a great change, a regeneration, sweeping away, cancelling old Victorian values, old traditional past values. They joined with the war with great heroism and a deep sense of patriotism. They wanted to show their national pride, their heroic courage, and that sense and spirit of adventure. So the first years were supported also by the strong propaganda, especially represented by the propaganda posters which covered the walls of the big towns in Britain. And these posters tried to convince the young soldier, the young men, the young fathers of the families to join the war, because that was a cause for the goodness of their families and of the nation. So these propaganda posters tried to instill a sense of patriotic duty in the young men of the nation. But very soon they understood, so just a few months after the beginning of the war, they understood that this heroism, nationalism and patriotism was just an illusion. Doubt and disillusionment took the place of that patriotism. They understood that war was just violence, destruction, suffering and profound pain, and finally death. So the attitude changed very soon, and the poetry of the war poets mirrored this more realistic way of describing the horror of the battles, writing from within the experience, from within their own experience in the trenches. They wanted to express and to speak out to the public who was at home, the families, the politicians, the old fathers, the terrible situation that they were living in the war and in the trenches. So Rupert Brooke, as I have said, is the first poet of this group of war poets. But we can say that stands a little apart from the others, because he actually experienced only the very first part, the very first, we could say, weeks of the experience of the war. Therefore, he didn't express the denouncement of the horror of the war, but on the contrary, he represented the heroic attitude and the propaganda of the first period.